It was the summer of 1987, inside a sold-out arena in Chicago, where the air buzzed with the kind of electric anticipation that makes every breath feel charged with possibility. The light shimmered across thousands of lifted faces, each one glowing with excitement as Stevie Wonder's music pulsed through the space like a living heartbeat. He had just finished a soaring run of notes when something in the atmosphere shifted, a subtle, almost spiritual tug that pulled his attention away. From the dazzling spotlight and toward the upper left section of the crowd, the audience sensed it instantly, their cheers softening into a low hum of curiosity as Stevie stepped back from his keyboard. It wasn't part of the show, wasn't rehearsed or planned, but the moment felt heavy with meaning, as though destiny were clearing its throat, preparing to speak. In that dim corner of the arena, half hidden behind taller bodies and lowered heads, sat a shy black kid no older than 13. He held his arms tightly across his chest, his shoulders curved inward like he was trying to fold himself into his seat. He wasn't used to crowds. He wasn't used to attention. He had come with a borrowed ticket, carrying a small dream tucked so deep inside him he rarely let it breathe. The dream of singing, not loudly, not boldly, just enough to feel a piece of the world shift in response to his voice. But the fear of being misunderstood, ignored, or judged had rooted that dream so tightly in silence that even he barely believed it existed. As Stevie's footsteps grew slower, more intentional, the boy's heart pounded faster, the vibrations of the music rumbling through his chest like distant thunder. Stevie paused at the edge of the stage, tilting his head as though listening for something no one else could hear. Then, with the quiet confidence of a man guided by instinct and soul, he lifted his hand and motioned for the band to stop. The sudden silence washed across the arena like a wave, leaving thousands suspended in breathless anticipation. Stevie pointed toward the boys' section, his voice warm but unmistakably clear as it echoed through the hushed space. "My little brother up there, come here." The words struck the shy kid with the force of a spotlight, freezing him in place as hundreds of heads turned in his direction. He shook his head instinctively, shrinking deeper into his seat. But destiny had already stepped forward, reaching for him with a certainty he could no longer outrun. The ushers hesitated for a moment, glancing at each other as if silently asking whether Stevie truly meant what he said. But when he extended his hand again, firm and patient, they understood. One of them made his way up the steps, moving carefully through the packed row until he reached the boy, who sat shaking so hard his knees knocked together. The kid's breath came in short, uneven bursts, his eyes fixed on the floor as though he could disappear into it. He whispered to his mother that he couldn't go, that he wasn't ready, that he didn't belong on any stage, especially not one shared with Stevie Wonder. But the usher gently touched his shoulder, speaking with the kindness of someone who recognized a terrified child, standing at the edge of something life-changing. "He's calling you, son," the usher murmured. "You don't have to be brave all at once. Just take one step." And with that single step, everything shifted. As he moved through the aisle, the arena around him transformed into a blur of whispers, gasps, and phone flashes as the crowd realized what was unfolding. Conversation rippled outward like waves spreading across a still lake. People leaned over railings, trying to catch a glimpse of the shy kid making his way toward the stage, each step echoing louder than the last in his trembling chest. He clutched the fabric of his shirt with sweaty fingers, feeling the weight of thousands of unseen eyes pressing down on him. His heart beat in frantic, uneven rhythms that matched the hollow thud of his shoes against the steps. In his mind, every insecurity screamed at once. He was too quiet, too awkward, too afraid, too invisible to stand beside a legend. And yet there was another voice beneath all the fear, a smaller, softer whisper urging him forward, reminding him that silence had never been the place he truly belonged. When he finally reached the foot of the stage, Stevie lowered himself to one knee, meeting the boy at eye level with a tenderness that immediately softened the trembling in his hands. Stevie didn't ask for a performance. He didn't demand courage. He simply smiled, a calm, warm expression that told the kid he wasn't being called into a spotlight. He was being invited into a moment. "You're safe here," Stevie said quietly, his words sinking deep into the boy's chest like a balm. The arena was silent now, suspended in breathless anticipation as Stevie extended his hand. The boy hesitated only a second more before placing his trembling fingers into Stevie's steady palm. And as Stevie gently helped him step onto the stage, the audience rose to their feet in a wave of emotion, as though they collectively understood that they were witnessing the beginning of something extraordinary. The moment the boy's sneakers touched the stage floor, the entire arena seemed to inhale at once, holding its breath in a silence thick enough to feel on the skin. The lights softened, dimming into a warm amber glow that wrapped around him like a gentle embrace, shielding him from the sharp edges of attention. He kept his eyes low, afraid to lift his head and see the ocean of people stretching out before him. His hands twitched at his sides, unsure of where to rest, unsure of how to stand, unsure of everything except the pounding of his heart echoing through his ears. Stevie remained beside him, one hand resting lightly on his back, not pushing him forward, but anchoring him so he wouldn't fall. "Just breathe," Stevie whispered, the words soft enough to disappear in the air, yet powerful enough to steady the boy's trembling knees. And slowly, the kid raised his chin a fraction, sensing the warmth of the spotlight rather than fearing it. Stevie took a small step back, giving the boy space to stand without leaning on him, but not so far that he would feel alone. The band watched from behind their instruments, frozen in awe, their hands hovering above keys and strings, as though afraid to disrupt the sacred stillness filling the stage. Even the backup singers stood perfectly still, hands pressed against their chests as they watched the boy struggle to find his footing in a moment far bigger than anything he had ever imagined. The kid swallowed hard, trying to quiet the storm of thoughts racing through his mind, every self-doubt, every memory of staying silent at school, every moment he had convinced himself that his voice didn't matter. The silence stretched on, not threatening but expectant, a hush that felt like the world leaning closer, waiting, hoping, believing in him more than he had ever believed in himself. Stevie reached behind him, grabbed the microphone from its stand and held it out, not thrusting it forward, not forcing it on the boy, but offering it gently, palm up, as though he were handing over something fragile and precious. The kid stared at it, his breathing shallow and uneven, the weight of the gesture sinking into his chest like a spark waiting to ignite. His fingers hovered over the microphone, trembling in the charged air between them. In that moment, it didn't feel like Stevie Wonder was handing him a piece of equipment. It felt like he was offering him a doorway, a chance to step out of the shadows he had lived in for so long. The boy hesitated, then closed his hand around the mic, clutching it, as though afraid it might vanish if he didn't hold on tightly enough. The arena erupted into soft, encouraging applause, but the boy didn't hear it as noise. He heard it as permission, permission to try, permission to exist, permission to be heard at last. The boy stood frozen for a long moment, gripping the microphone with both hands, as if it were the only solid thing anchoring him to the stage. His breath quivered in his chest, rising and falling in shallow waves that threatened to collapse at any second. He could feel the warmth of Stevie standing just behind him, a quiet reassurance that kept him from slipping back into the shadows. The arena was still, so still that the faint hum of amplifiers sounded like distant thunder. Thousands of faces stared at him, but the silence wasn't hostile. It was full of hope, full of collective anticipation, full of strangers who wanted to believe this shy kid could lift his voice high enough to shake the air around them. For the first time in his life, he felt like the world wasn't pushing him down. It was waiting for him to rise. Stevie leaned closer, speaking softly into the boy's ear, his voice steady, confident, and impossibly gentle. "Don't think about them," he whispered. "Just sing what lives in you." The boy closed his eyes, letting the words settle into the tight spaces inside him where fear had taken root over the years. His fingers tightened around the microphone, pressing grooves into the metal. As he tried to steady the trembling in his arms, memories flickered through him, days when he hummed quietly so no one could hear, nights when he buried his voice under blankets out of fear someone might judge him. Moments when he swallowed his talent because courage felt like something other people were born with. But here, on this massive stage beside a legend who understood the journey from silence to sound, something unexpected stirred inside him. Not confidence, something softer, more fragile, permission. With his eyes still closed, he lifted the microphone toward his lips. The simple movement sparked a wave of whispers across the arena, a ripple of disbelief and hope passing from seat to seat. The musicians behind him leaned forward slightly, as if drawn in by an invisible force. Stevie stepped back just enough to let the boy claim the space, but not so far that he felt abandoned. The boy inhaled deeply, his first real breath since stepping onto the stage, and the sound of it echoed faintly through the speakers. Then, in one trembling exhale, he began to sing. The first note was barely more than a whisper, shaking and thin, a fragile thread almost lost in the vastness of the room. But it was real. It was honest. It was the sound of a boy stepping out of the shadows for the first time. And as that note drifted into the silence, the entire arena leaned forward in awe, sensing that something extraordinary was just beginning. The boy's first note trembled in the air, wavering like a flame fighting against wind, but instead of fading, it slowly strengthened, stretching into a fragile ribbon of sound that drifted across the arena with a purity no one expected. Every rise, every shake, every uncertain edge of his voice felt achingly human, as though he were peeling back the layers of his own fear in real time. The audience remained frozen, the silence so complete it swallowed even the soft rustle of clothing and the shifting of feet. People leaned forward unconsciously, their eyes widening, their breaths held captive by the raw honesty pouring from a voice that had lived its entire life in hiding. The boy's throat quivered, his eyebrows tightening as he reached for another note, one slightly stronger, slightly braver. And as it rang out through the speakers, a wave of emotion rippled across the arena, gentle gasps, widening eyes, hands rising to mouths in astonishment. No one had expected this shy, trembling kid to sound like that. Stevie watched with a quiet, almost reverent smile, his head tilting slightly as though listening not just to the sound, but to the story beneath it. He swayed subtly, his hands clasped in front of him, resisting the urge to step forward and join in. This wasn't his moment to share. It belonged entirely to the boy finding his voice in front of thousands who had come for Stevie, but were now witnessing something far more intimate. The band, still frozen behind their instruments, exchanged stunned glances, unsure whether to remain still or to gently support the trembling melody unfolding before them. The pianist hovered his fingers above the keys, afraid to play a single note that might overshadow the boy's fragile courage. Even the security guards lining the stage, men trained to stay stoic, found themselves blinking rapidly, their faces softening as they watched the transformation taking place in front of them. The second phrase, the boy sang, came out fuller, warmer, shaped by a breath that rose from someplace deeper than fear. The audience felt it instantly, the subtle shift from survival to expression, from trembling uncertainty to something approaching bravery. The sound floated upward, grazing the rafters, weaving itself into the very air of the arena. Faces throughout the crowd began to crumble with emotion. eyes filling with tears, hands pressed to hearts as if trying to steady the impact of what they were hearing. This wasn't a polished performance. It wasn't a rehearsed moment. It was the rarest thing of all, truth in its rawest form. And when the boy finally closed his mouth, letting the last trembling note fade into the vast, breathless space around him, the silence that followed felt monumental, as though the world itself needed a moment to understand what had just happened. Then, like a thunderclap, the arena erupted. The eruption of applause exploded through the arena like a shockwave, crashing over the boy in a roar so powerful it almost knocked the breath from his lungs. People leapt to their feet without thinking, hands flying upward, voices breaking into cheers that shook the very structure of the building. Some screamed his name even though they didn't know it. Others simply sobbed, overwhelmed by the purity of what they had just witnessed. The boy stumbled back a half step, startled by the eruption, gripping the microphone as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. His chest heaved with ragged breaths, his mind struggling to make sense of the tidal wave of emotion washing over him. He had never imagined his voice reaching more than a few feet in front of him, yet here he was, standing at the center of a world he had just shaken without even meaning to. Stevie moved toward him slowly, almost cautiously, as though approaching something sacred. His smile was gentle, proud, glowing like a quiet flame in the dimmed lights. When he reached the boy, he placed a steady hand on his shoulder, grounding him in the middle of the storm. "Look what you did," Stevie murmured, leaning close so only the boy could hear. "Look what your truth did." The words hit the boy with a force stronger than the applause. His eyes filled instantly, his throat tightening as a wave of disbelief washed through him. He couldn't look at the crowd, couldn't process the standing ovation, the tears, the cheers, but he could feel it. He could feel the warmth of thousands of strangers pouring toward him like sunlight breaking through clouds. For the first time in his life, he wasn't shrinking from attention. He was receiving it. Stevie slowly raised the boy's hand, lifting it gently as the crowd screamed louder, the ovation rising into something that felt less like applause and more like collective gratitude. The boy's knees trembled, but Stevie held him steady, guiding him into the moment with care. "You're not small," Stevie whispered, his voice trembling with sincerity. "Not tonight. Not ever." The boy wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, overwhelmed by a feeling he couldn't name, something between joy and disbelief, something he had never felt so intensely before. He looked out at the blurred sea of lights and silhouettes before him, not seeing details, but feeling the weight, the warmth, the truth of their reaction. And for the first time, the boy allowed himself to stand tall, his chest lifting, his chin rising just a little, as though accepting the piece of destiny that had quietly waited for him all his life. The audience eventually softened their cheers into a warm, glowing hush, a collective breath that felt almost reverent as Stevie kept his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. He didn't rush the moment, he didn't push the kid back into silence. Instead, he let him stand there, absorbing the weight of thousands who had just witnessed something pure, unexpected, and transformative. The boy's breathing steadied as the overwhelming noise faded into a gentle hum of admiration surrounding him like a protective circle. He blinked through the bright stage lights, overwhelmed not by what he saw, but by what he felt. An unmistakable sense of belonging that stretched far beyond the edge of the stage. Stevie turned to face him fully, bending slightly to meet his eyes, his expression softening into something almost paternal. "You changed the room, tonight," he whispered. "You changed all of us." The boy's lips trembled into a tiny, grateful smile, his voice too tangled in emotion to form any words. Stevie stepped back, giving the boy space to breathe as the crowd once again swelled in applause, though gentler this time, warmer, more intimate, like a collective embrace. The band members stood frozen in awe behind their instruments, exchanging looks that carried a mix of disbelief and admiration, as though they understood this moment would echo in their memories for years. Even the crew members at the edge of the stage, people used to the chaos and unpredictability of live shows, looked shaken, their eyes glistening with emotion they couldn't hide. Stevie signaled subtly for the lights to soften, surrounding the boy in a halo of golden warmth that made him appear almost luminous on the stage. It wasn't theatrics, it wasn't production, it was respect, honor, a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the most powerful voices come from those who never believed they had one. Then, with a tenderness that felt like a blessing, Stevie took the microphone from the boy's hands, not to reclaim it, but to hold the moment steady. He raised the mic to his own lips, letting the room fall into a hush so complete it felt like the world had paused. "This," Stevie said, nodding toward the boy, "is what happens when we make space for someone who's been hiding in silence." The crowd erupted once more, tears streaming, hands lifted, hearts cracked wide open. Stevie wrapped an arm around the boy's shoulders, pulling him into a gentle side embrace as the arena roared with love. And in that deafening wave of sound, the boy didn't feel shy. He didn't feel small. He felt seen, fully, powerfully, undeniably seen. He lifted his chin, letting the applause wash over him like sunlight. For the first time, he didn't shrink. He rose,